Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Zabaani. This is a podcast event brought to you by the Statesmanship Program, where we plan to bring atypical topics in an unconventional manner. This week at Zabaani, we talk about the current state of the Indian economy and the economies worldwide. I am Mehul Joshi, an editor at the Statesmanship Program. I am a first year economics student from Mumbai, and I shall be serving as the moderator for this event. Today we have with us Mr. Siddharth Singhai. Mr. Siddharth Singhai is the co-founder and chief investment officer at Ironhold Capital. Sir is a graduate from the Fordham Gabelli School of Business in Finance. Sir has also worked as a consultant and analyst at multiple investment capital firms. Sir, we are honored to have you here with us today at Zabani. This
Thank
week,
you, Mel.
Thank you. So this week we're talking about economies worldwide in this episode of Zabani. So we'll start off. The COVID-19 pandemic hit the world economy while they were already reeling from an ongoing recession. Governments worldwide have been grappling to respond to the same. The Indian economy at specific shrunk by 23.9% in August 2020, and the Indian government also expressed its intention of dealing with financial obligations through act of God or force majeure measures. So, in such situations, how has the global market responded to Indian government's economic response, and what have been the multiple views that the global market holds with respect to Indian government's response?
Yeah, so I mean, the Indian government really can do two things, right? Lower the interest rates and print money. They only have those two levers. So they're doing what they can. Obviously, printing money, is not without consequences. It will have, it could lead to inflation, and predicting anything on the macro side of things is always very difficult. So for me to say, if you do X, Y will happen. That's not necessarily true. Like we printed a lot of money here in the United States in the Great Recession of '08, and we did not suffer any inflation, right? So the Indian government's response, I think, is adequate. They've been forced to take these measures against their will, I would say, and it's not going to be pretty, I would say. There's no other alternative where you have both GDP growth and you also keep the interest rates down. You don't do stimulus, and we're unfortunately stuck with a really terrible disease that is pretty, infectious, and nobody expected that. But you're right. We were already not in very good shape pre-COVID. There was some economic slowdown, and I think this was expected, I would say, more or less. Eventually, the economy will have to, catch up with reality. It cannot always do well. That being said, I don't think it's going to be, you will see a recovery, right? Eventually. It always has happened. Look at 200 years history of United States, or, the 50 or so year history of India and the financial markets and the economy. They will eventually recover, right?
Yes.
So it's a matter of time, but we will have to, obviously, it will get worse before it gets better, I would say.
Makes complete sense. So we see developing countries like India still, struggling to respond, and for that matter, even the developed countries like the United States of America have been, facing severe difficulties for the same. So while the pandemic still continues, countries like Burkina Faso have been grappling to respond to this pandemic, with food insecurity becoming an extremely pertinent issue in these countries. Something that the Food and Agriculture Department of the UN has also reported. So, what policy instruments do governments in low income countries have in order to ensure food security and basic subsistence in times like that of a pandemic?
See, so the problem is more systemic, right? Burkina Faso or any other low income country, and um, even India about 30, 40 years ago was, we were ravaged with famines and things of that nature ourselves. The solution really is that everybody makes enough money to, you know, be able to sustain themselves, and it's not reliant on government aid. That's the long-term definitive solution. And that's the best way to implement that is by having a capitalistic economy, right? Low regulations, ease of business formation, access to capital for entrepreneurs. And, you know, it has plenty of natural resources, right? That's not a problem. Um, yeah, educated labor might be a problem, right? So you have to obviously educate people, but there's no economic policy as such that you can devise that will take care of this, because this is going to happen again and again and again. The only way to get rid of it completely, right, is by following, you know, having a capitalistic economy. Because, you know, if you remember, China was a superpower, you know, in the 1800s, right? They had a huge population. US, by comparison, was, you know, a tiny, tiny country, both in terms of GDP and actual population. But US had one thing going for it, which was capitalism, right? China, on the other hand, didn't. So even with their huge population and natural resource and everything else, the tiny population of the United States was able to, you know, be able to do well for itself over the next couple of centuries. People were just as smart in China. Natural resources were just as plenty, but the system was capitalism. That was the difference, right? So, as you mentioned, the problem with most of those countries, you know, where you have a sizable percentage of the population below the poverty line, is the government is, you know, either has really poor regulations that do not support business formation, or, you know, they just punish you for being either entrepreneurial or, you know, uh, you want to start your own thing, any kind of business that will eventually employ people. It's not, you know, encouraged in the States, or, you know, even some of the other developed economies, even something like Japan. That is not the case, right? So systematically, it's poor governance, but it's also heavy-handed regulations, and not much focus on business formation, because you need to get people to work for themselves and earn that income, right, based on merit. And once they have that system in place, I think and it will take time, possibly a decade or so. Um, but I think that's perhaps in the long term the only solution that I see.
Makes complete sense, sir. So, with respect to even capitalist economies, or be it a capitalist economy or socialist economies like China itself, pandemic comes at a time wherein our healthcare systems, something that has been very well, recognized, has been that our healthcare systems are fundamentally flawed. Something even in pre-COVID times, if you look at the U.S. election of 2016, the Trump administration has been very clear about one thing, that they are opposed to the Obama cares, and there has been much debate, not just in the States, but worldwide, about healthcare systems. So with COVID 19 hitting these systems with an unprecedented burden, we're seeing the flaws of these systems being more visible than ever. In such time, one thing that we've all recognized is that a universal healthcare is somewhere a requirement of the hour, wherein countries like UK, France, which already have a universal healthcare, have been better off in this entire procedure. So, with respect to, say, universal healthcare and convergence of information technology into health sector, what reforms do you think are needed in the health sector right now, and how can governments go about the same?
So India and US are vastly different when it comes to healthcare, right? In India, you typically don't have a lot of R&D. It's basically taking the formulations that were developed elsewhere, either in US or other countries, and then just mass producing them, right? So we essentially do mass scale manufacturing of drugs. We do not develop them. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Uh, the problem is our competitor is China. If you look at almost 90% of all chemicals that are used for, you know, formation of these drugs, they come from China for pretty much, you know, pretty much all of the world, really. You know, they have the lead in manufacturing that we wish to emulate. So COVID, I think, as you rightly mentioned, right? President Trump is looking to obviously de-risk some of that supply chain that exists in China. You might see, I mean, we should look at that as an opportunity for India to step up its manufacturing. And so it's not um, a bad thing overall in the long run, obviously. In the short run, the issue of healthcare is sort of controversial because um, you do have to pay for it, right? You pay for it collectively, right? You get taxed. You know, it's not free in that sense. Um, and what is the best possible way to do it? Like, do you want to have private companies, right, take care of people's health, which is the case here in the United States? I mean, or do you want all of it to be uh, you know, somewhat governed by politics to an extent? You know, you don't want government intervention to the extent that it causes drug prices to balloon up, right? So that is a tricky conversation. Should we privatize it? Then if you privatize it, you know, some people will be obviously gated off, right? So I think a solution would be somewhere in between, where you don't have this complete socialist uh, foundation, right? Where the government takes care of everybody, right? Because the government is not really good at running businesses, right? And you do want to have competition so that you keep the drug prices down. At the same time, um, you do want to have some amount of regulations for private healthcare companies so they can't just, you know, spike up drug prices as they do in the United States. So I don't think any country has figured out healthcare perfectly, to be honest. But solution would be a hybrid. You know, you'll have some amount of government supervision over private pharma that enables both competitive prices, but not, you know, almost exploitation of people who do need it.
Makes complete sense. Or a mixed economic structure is somewhere you find balance between both of them. With so you mentioned about how the U.S. healthcare systems is well in your answer, right? So with the U.S. With the people of America going to vote for their next president in the month of November itself, something that's of great conversation now is what does this hold for the global market? What does a possible Trump re-election have with respect to global markets and the American economy itself? And what does the election of Vice President Biden mean if for the global market?
Um, so if you look at long term, right, 10, 15, 20 years, the only one uh, factor that will determine the health of the economy, in my view, would be the tax rate, right? Because if you have extraordinarily high tax rate, you sort of deter from business formation, right? You you cannot have tax rate in the high 60s or 70s and also have people take on additional amount of risk. You know, they risk failure, they risk putting all that time for nothing to then part away with 60, 70% of their earnings. A lot of people will just never, you know, uh, get started, and you don't want that. That being said, you also want to tax people fairly, so we're all paying our fair share, right? Um, I think that is going to be the key difference. Apart from that, if you look at, you know, economy over long periods of time, 25, 30, 50 years, it really doesn't matter who the president is, right? It What matters are what are the economic policies for the long run. And as long as you have a capitalistic system where people are incentivized to work, do the best they can, and they get paid in proportion to that, right? Where the right to property, right? You don't want somebody to take away a house that you work so hard for, or your, you know, belongings, or, you know, you don't want anarchy. You want safety in society. As long as we, you know, any country takes care of those things, has some amount of social safety net at the bottom, right? Take care of people who are disabled, you know, or just unlucky. We take care of them, and then over that you have capitalism to ensure that people are incentivized to do the right thing. I think the economy is going to do well. So Um, as far as if Mr. Biden wins or President Trump wins, I think that's apart from the taxation, which I don't think is going to be as crazy as people expect it to, even under President Biden. Um, it shouldn't have a big effect on the economy.
Makes sense. So basically, like both Trump and Biden, to an extent, are free market capitalists. So that wouldn't bring a much change. But something that we've noticed in the Trump regime itself has been that there have been a significant cult in the social security net. Something that you mentioned about, right? How social security nets are needed in a capitalist system as well. So we've noticed that the Trump administration has been time and again cutting their allocation to the social security schemes. So given that countries like India also are following a progressively capitalistic system in their approach, how do you think social security and protection of people can be something that can be imbibed in a capitalist system?
Well, so if you look at Social Security in terms, it does a lot of good. Absolutely, you need it to take care of people. Obviously, people are not great investors. In general, the population does not believe in investing. They don't save enough. They don't invest enough. So, Social Security is essential. I wouldn't take that away. Uh, I would augment it slightly. Obviously, in Australia, they have a thing called superannuation, right? Um, if I boil down the whole thing, they just um, it's social security with some modifications added on, right? You force people to invest, you force them to start early, right? You give young people money because we know compounding, right? If you start early and you start out with little amounts, right? It's like being at the top of a mountain. You let a small snowball, right? You roll it off and then you wait, and it just grows exponentially as it rolls down the hill. So you don't need a lot to start with, right? But you need something, and you need to invest. Um, so superannuation sort of takes Social Security and adds the element of compound interest to that. So I think we can do something like that. I don't think I'm not personally aware if he's cutting down Social Security. I don't think that is the case. Uh, However, I don't think it's a good idea to get rid of it. I think we can certainly augment it.
Makes sense also. Now that the people, like the younger generations at least, are more aware than ever that there's this knowledge about even complex technical fields such as finance and technology in young and budding college students and school students as well. And with societies like India itself accepting finance, investment, and and economics as considerable career options, we're seeing a rise in the number of people who are going into these fields as well. So if I were to ask you, what is your advice to these people, to the younger generations who are looking at a future in investment in finance and in general as well, the people who are not in these fields, what can they do in order to build their financial acumen?
Um, so, so it's a two-part question. So first is for people who are interested in finance, want to pursue it as a career. I would say you have to be interested. I think that's the only requirement. Finance is not very complicated, though we make it to be that way. But it's not. At the end of the day, it's everything relating to money, right? Providing money to people, making money from money, right? Those are the two big things in finance. And so whether you work for venture capital, right? You work for private equity, you work for mutual fund, hedge funds, right? Or you work for alternative investment funds. It's all the same thing, right? There's a lot of fluff. You just take money and you invest it, you know, in some other place. That's the crux of it. So as long as people are interested, they're passionate about it, I think they should go forward. You know, but India especially, I think, is primed for explosion of finance over the next decade. So I think it's a great place to be. Uh, yeah, on your second, um, the thing is, I do not suggest that people invest in individual common stocks, right? in the sense that you shouldn't be picking if, you should invest in Tata or you should be investing in Aisha Motors or whatever. You shouldn't be doing that because to an extent, it's like doing your own neurosurgery. Unless you have done it for a number of years, you're a professional in the field, uh, you shouldn't do it at all. You shouldn't think of investing as gambling. It's not gambling, right? You should have a 3 to 4 year investment horizon. You should think of yourself as a business owner. So if you own your local bakery, 5% of that, 5% of your, best auto car dealership in town, 5% of your laundromat, and you wouldn't sell those businesses just because they did poorly for a month or so, right? You'd keep, as long as fundamentally they're good businesses, you're gonna keep running them for years and years and years. Stocks are no different. Stocks are partial ownership of businesses. You take 5% ownership in 20 different high quality businesses, right? You should be good. The point is, you have to think of yourself as a business owner when you're investing in stocks. That's what it is. You're getting a part of a business. And you don't sell it just because somebody tells you it's going to go down. You don't buy more of it just because somebody tells you it's going to go up, right? So having the right mentality is essential. That being said, going back to my previous example, right? You want to start early. So if I were to ask you a question, right? Who do you think has more money in his bank account, right? One who starts at 25, invests 5,000 rupees every month for 25 years, or the second person who starts out at 35, invests 20,000 rupees every month for 15 years, assuming they both get 15% annually. What do you think?
I would say the person who started off early because at
Yeah,
25, because as the period is something that will help him.
exactly. So you don't have to have a lot of money. You can start out with little money. I think the person starting out at 25, only investing 5,000 for 25 years, at the age of 50 will have about 1.3 crore rupees. You know, you guys don't take my word for it, do the math yourself. And the second person would have 1.2, even though he is investing 4 times as much. But he started out late. So he missed out on those 10 years and they make a huge difference, right? Now, I wouldn't suggest you only put 5 grand, right? It depends on your financial position, how much you can. Only invest as much as you wouldn't need. Never invest anything that you might need. Something might come up in the next 6 months, like this crisis, right? You need to be in cash. So whatever you can afford, to not touch is what you should put aside. That being said, start early, invest in index funds. Don't pick individual stocks, or find somebody who's really good at investing, right? So that's hard, you know. Um, if you buy, 5,000 rupees worth of Sensex or Nifty 50 every month, you just buy it and you don't look at it, you're going to do well. If you try and time the market, try and figure out what's going to happen, how I can beat it, how I can get better than 15%, or try and get rich quick, that's not what the stock market is for.
Makes complete sense. All. So, in today's episode, we understood about how the current economies are doing and how the global market has viewed Indian economy's response to the pandemic. We talked about how countries like Burkina Faso and low-income countries can deal with the pandemic. We've seen how healthcare systems need to revive and what can be done with respect to that, and the US elections. And at the end, we talked about how financial acumen can be built up in the youth as well. With this, we come to the end of this episode of Zabaani. Sir, we're extremely thankful and grateful that you could spare time from your extremely busy schedule and come here and give your words of motivation and guidance to the younger generations. With that,
Thank you.
thank you so much. This was the fourth episode of Zabani. If you liked the episode, you can go and follow the Statesmanship program on Instagram. We'll be back next week with another episode on another unconventional topic, dealing with the same in an atypical manner. Thank you so much and stay tuned.